And I want to leave you with a ray of hope about how this 100 Years' War might be ended in a way providing justice and equality for all concerned, the Palestinian people and the Israeli people. In order to do that, in order to achieve justice and equality, I think several conditions need to be present. And I'm going to talk about those conditions before I conclude. One of these conditions is Palestinian unity around a well-defined strategic aim. I argue in the book that there is no clear Palestinian strategic aim today, and that the Palestinian national movement is divided, and that it is at its lowest ebb since 1948. It's clear that if the Palestinians are going to secure their rights, all of these trends have to be reversed. Palestinians have to unify, they have to figure out exactly what they want, they have to develop a strategy to do that, and I lay out some of the things that I would argue have to be done in the book. So that's the first precondition. A second precondition is that there has to be a fundamental change in the Arab situation. The Arabs are divided and weak. Arab governments are not really fully independent. They are more dependent today in some respects than they were when they were under colonial rule. We're living in a neo-colonial era in the Arab world. The Arab world has the lowest index of democracy of any region in the entire world, the largest number of dictatorships and absolute monarchies. In fact, the only absolute monarchies on earth, several of them, more absolute than Louis XIV's or John I's absolute monarchies. That has to change. I would argue that this division and this weakness of the Arab world has been a vital precondition for Israel's victories in several stages of this war since the 1930s, and for Israel's continued domination of the region today. There are many reasons for this weakness, but central to this Arab weakness is the absence of democracy and egalitarian governments in most parts of the Arab world. The perpetuation with external support of undemocratic autocratic regimes that do not represent the strong pro-Palestinian sentiment of most Arabs is a guarantee of the supremacy not only of Israel, but of Israel's Western backers in the Arab world. They can get away with what they get away with because the Arabs are so weak and divided and are led by illegitimate, unrepresentative rulers who are entirely dependent on external support for staying in power, for keeping their thrones and their seats and the ill-gotten gains that these kleptocracies suck out of their countries. Now, that may sound like a tall order, changing that reality. But I would argue that the upheavals of 2011, the so-called Arab Spring, which produced, unfortunately, only one success in the new democracy in Tunisia, and now the strong democratic movements that refuse to bow in Algeria, in Sudan, in Iraq, and in Lebanon are all signs that the dictators and absolute monarchs who blight this region will not remain unchallenged. There is a powerful desire for liberation from these governments all over the Arab world. I'm not suggesting that that will change things immediately, but I think that you cannot hold that current down indefinitely. So that's the second precondition, positive change in the Arab world away from dictatorship and absolute monarchy. Finally, there are going to have to be some essential changes in this country and in Europe. These are the essential backers of the colonial settler war on Palestine that is grinding on today, house by house, settlement by settlement, excavation by excavation in Jerusalem, in the West Bank, in the Gaza Strip, in other parts of Palestine, in a variety of different forms. Without that backing, that project could not continue. The money comes from here, the arms come from here, the diplomatic support comes from here, the trade is with here, the investment is from here. This entire project is, for all its power, for all its independence, is dependent on the support of this metropole, the Euro-American metropole, like any colonial settler project. And I think that here, in the United States and Europe, there's actually some good news. As the so-called peace plan, I refuse to call it a peace plan, that was released yesterday shows, we're now facing the most anti-Palestinian administration in U.S. history, which is saying something, given some of its predecessors. Together with its allies in the Netanyahu government and in the Israel lobby, it has launched a fierce campaign, not only in Palestine, but also here in this country and in Europe, against the movements that are working for Palestinian rights, like the BDS movement, like Students for Justice in Palestine, like movements all across Europe and on American campuses. This campaign involves heavy-handed legal means, restrictions on academic freedom and freedom of speech, vast amounts of money, and insidious propaganda that slanderously paints almost any criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic. That's actually a gesture of desperation. When you have no arguments and you have to slander your opponent as anti-Semitic, it means you're really down to your last argument. It's the argument of scoundrels to make these accusations against people who are simply arguing for Palestinian human and political and national rights. In spite of this campaign, and in spite of the Trump administration's many punitive measures against the Palestinians themselves, including this so-called deal of the century, there is a growing groundswell of popular support for Palestinian rights in several arenas in this country. I won't talk about Europe, I'll just talk about the United States. I'll talk about a few of them. One of them is what's happening on US campuses, including the campus right down the street. When I was a student at Yale in the late 1960s, a long time ago, Golda Meir visited the law school. She was met by hundreds of delirious supporters, hundreds, maybe 1,000. They packed the law school auditorium, they were outside. Hundreds in favor, there were 4 of us protesting against Golda's visit. I think that was an accurate reflection of where things stood back in the late 1960s. Things have changed. I could give you multiple examples. One example is the passing of pro-BDS student resolutions at Barnard College, at Brown University, and at universities all over the United States. There are many other examples. This is happening in spite of an unprecedentedly vicious campaign to suppress freedom of speech and to paint anybody who dares to raise their head in support of Palestinian rights as an anti-Semite. I think that that's an indication of something really important. The fact that the youngest and the smartest people in this country don't believe the nonsense that their elders were fed, and that they're beginning to free themselves of. That is an enormously interesting and important sign. A second sign, maybe less visible, is what's happening in academia, among academics, especially in some fields like history or anthropology or American studies or cultural studies, where there's a growing intolerance for the largely false received narrative about Israel and Palestine, and a growing importance of elements of a more objective and historically correct narrative. I will just give you one piece of evidence of the fact that things are beginning to change. Annually, articles from the Journal of Palestine Studies, which is an objective journal, I edit it, I know it's objective, annually, 200,000 articles, full articles, are downloaded from the Journal of Palestine Studies, mainly by students and academics in the United States. Now, they read other things. The point is they have access to objective material on the subject, and they use it. And when you have objective work and you have cheap propaganda, objective work usually wins out. And that's one reason academics in many, many fields in the United States simply will not tolerate the kind of nonsense that passed for reality and truth several decades ago. And there have been major changes in academia as a result. Things that everybody believed. Israel was in danger of extinction and annihilation in 1967. Not true. Was never true. The Israeli military knew it. U.S. military knew it. U.S. intelligence knew it. Every academic now knows it. Who cares to look at it? You couldn't find those realities before. Everybody knows them now. The Arab leaders told their people to flee. No, they didn't. And on and on and on. Lie after lie after lie is no longer current among respectable academic circles. And that is a major change. Let me give you a third change that many of you may be aware of. And this is a change that's taking place at the base of the Democratic Party. There were repeated polls, Pew Research Center and many others, that illustrate a shift away from unconditional support for Israel and towards greater support for Palestinian rights among important elements among the base of the Democratic Party. The extremism of the Israeli government, popular hostility towards the Trump administration have forced even elements of the traditionally pro-Israel party leadership closer to its party base that is increasingly sympathetic to the Palestine cause. Unfortunately, while only a few party leaders have modified their strongly pro-Israeli stance, and only Bernie Sanders and just yesterday Elizabeth Warren spoke to the growing beliefs of a growing body of more open-minded members of the party, a change is nevertheless taking place. And I would argue that the discourse has begun to shift away from the blanket support from everything and anything that Israel does that is characteristic of the party leadership and of many big donors to the Democratic Party. The base is moving away from those positions very rapidly, which is why candidates for the presidency, like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, are taking the positions that they do. There's a fourth change going on, and this is taking place among the younger segment of the Jewish community, which has evolved in recent years away from blind support for Israel to more nuanced positions. This isn't true of everybody, but it's happening among a very important segment of the younger part of the Jewish community. There's more and more questioning of false narratives that have prevailed for so long, and while there are some groups like Jewish Voice for Peace or Not in Our Name that have actually taken major steps in support of Palestinian rights, even more moderate groups like J Street have become critical of Israeli policies. Now, while the leadership, the establishment leadership of the community, and most of its older and richer members are still anchored in the past and believe everything they were ever told, there's a growing gulf over Palestine-Israel between them and the many younger members of the community who are becoming more and more enlightened. And that's an enormously important cause for optimism. Finally, the fifth major change is that Arab Americans and Muslim Americans are finally becoming more active politically. More of them are running for office, more of them are donating to political campaigns, more of them are becoming involved in legal efforts to defend Palestinian rights and freedom of speech. This is a function of the coming of age of a new generation in these communities who are the offspring of immigrants from the Middle East who only arrived in large numbers after the racist U.S. immigration laws were liberalized in 1965. The bulk of the Arab American population came here in the last 30 or 40 or 50 years. Unlike most other immigrant communities in this country, which are well established, the Arab American community is not. But now we have young people who are assimilated and are confident enough to assert themselves politically, and that's beginning to have an effect on local politics at least, and one day perhaps national politics. I have one more reason for optimism, and this is that while Israel is extraordinarily strong in many respects, economically, militarily, and others, it's a nuclear power with an air force that has actually bombed 7 Arab capitals with impunity, gotten away with it. Nothing happened to Israel, but 7 Arab capitals have been bombed in the past decades. In spite of all of this strength, Israel is ultimately dependent on support from the European and especially the American metropole. There is an increasing realization in the United States and in Europe of the incompatibility between the democratic, egalitarian ideals of liberal democracies, like ours supposedly is, like Britain supposedly is, like France supposedly is, and the exclusivist, narrow chauvinism of Israel. This is particularly true after Israel in 2018 enacted into constitutional law a provision that Israel is a state for only one people, the Jewish people, in a land which it controls absolutely from the river to the sea, and which is a land with 2 peoples. I think that the Trump-Netanyahu plan will deepen the sense of the discriminatory and utterly illiberal nature of Israel in an era where those things are no longer acceptable in liberal democracies. Yes, there are right-wing tendencies in many European countries, in this country, among the president's supporters, but ultimately those ideas are incompatible with liberal democracy. We're still far away, I think, from these things changing. But I think we can step back and see that really, historically, there have only been 3 possible solutions for cases of settler colonialism. Either the expulsion or extermination of the indigenous population, which happened in some cases, but which is unthinkable in the 21st century, or the equally unthinkable expulsion of the settlers, which happened in Algeria, but which is equally unthinkable in the 21st century, or finally, finding some form of coexistence based on justice and equality of rights without oppression and discrimination of one people by another. Obviously, that's an ideal solution that's not on the horizon. But I think that there are straws in the wind, I've pointed to some of them, that indicate that we may be going towards a better future. Whether these are insistent demands for democratic change in the Arab world, whether this is the growth of global sympathy for Palestinian rights, or whether this is the rise of new global powers combined with the slow diminution of the role of the United States in the Middle East. Whether these or other changes take place, in the end, a 19th century colonial project cannot persist in the 21st century. It's marching against the tide of history. There can be no lasting peace or security for either the Palestinian or the Israeli peoples as long as one people oppresses another with the support of outside powers. Only a peace based on justice and complete absolute equality of rights, personal, human, and national rights, can bring this 100 years war to an end and can offer liberation from bondage that the Palestinian people deserve. I would be happy to take some questions.
I wanted, given the enormous disparity in power between Israel and the Palestinians, and given the Trump-Kushner-Netanyahu plan, which is already leading to annexation of a third of the West Bank, what do you think Palestinians in the occupied territories and Palestinian citizens of Israel can do on the ground, practically speaking? You mentioned BDS, which is an international effort, but what can Palestinians do now to resist? What weapons do they have at their disposal?
Yeah. I mean, it's easy for me to sit here in New York and talk about what Palestinians there should do. They have a very much harder row to hoe in most ways than those of us who live in comfort outside. But one of the things that I argue in the book is that you have to have a unified strategy. You have to have a strategy that's global. You have to have a strategy to appeal to the Arab peoples over the heads of their governments. You have to have a strategy to appeal to the rest of the world. You have to have a strategy to appeal to Israelis. You have to show them that a future other than continued oppression of the Palestinian people is possible. And you have to be able to show that there's a cost to continued occupation and oppression. And you have to do that in a way that doesn't trigger the kind of defensive reaction that various forms of resistance have triggered in the past. Israel is a peculiar case, coming out of a peculiar historical circumstance. In the book, I talk about Iqbal Ahmed's analysis of Palestinian armed struggle and how in various respects it was inappropriate to this case. This was a man who had been involved in the Algerian National Liberation Movement. This is a man who knew Frantz Fanon. This is a man who had no objection in principle to armed struggle. And he came to South Lebanon and he looked at what was happening saying, it won't work in this case. And I share that view. I'm not saying armed struggle is illegitimate in cases like this. It's not illegitimate. I'm suggesting it's not the appropriate strategy for reasons peculiar and specific to this case. But there are other forms of resistance. I think the Palestinians really have to study not just their past, looking at the First Intifada and the ways in which it worked, or looking at the strikes of the 30s and the ways in which they worked, but look at other international examples. Look at the Irish example. Look at how the Irish boycott is an Irish tactic started in Ireland in the 1880s. It's not a Palestinian or a South African or an Indian tactic, but it was used in certain ways in Ireland, it was used in certain ways in India, and it was used successfully. So I think that there has to be a little broader vision of what you can do, a borrowing of tactics from the Palestinian past, from the past of regional national liberation movements, and global national liberation movements like the Indian and the Irish and others. All of them have to then be adapted to the peculiar situation the Palestinians are in. I think they can also learn a great deal from the Palestinians inside Israel, who have by far the most evolved understanding of exactly how Israel works. They have been dealing with it for 73, 72 years now. They really understand how the system works. Their Hebrew is better than many Israelis. Their understanding of the legal system, the lawyers' understanding of the legal system, the politicians' understanding, the journalists' understanding, the analysts, it's better than any other Palestinians by far. which is not to say they always follow the right tactics, but using and learning from them is something that Palestinians should be doing, not just Palestinians inside Palestine, but Palestinians everywhere. So there are many, many things that can be done. The first thing to do is to get this, to unify your national movement. The Palestinian national movement was for a period unified, and in spite of many, many errors, I talk about the mistakes that the PLO made by the bushel, it achieved a great deal simply by unifying representation of the Palestinians. And that's something that's been lost. And that has to be recovered as a precondition for anything else. So there are many, many things. And some of these things, the lead can be taken from outside. It doesn't have to be taken by people inside. I mean, one of the things that the PLO did wrong was to put itself at the mercy of the Israeli occupation. The entire leadership puts itself in a cage, which is what they've done, and put themselves at the mercy for their movement, for their permits of the oppressor. It's absurd. No national liberation movement in history has ever done anything so foolish. And so there are various things that have to be done, and should be done, and can be done.
You spoke at great length about the support Israel has received from the US and European states over the years. You also talked about the weak Arab states, people being oppressed in Arab societies. Mm-hmm. I would like to hear from you, from the view of the Palestinian people, which support from the Arab world is most important, and how has this changed over the years? So essentially, which Arab states are supporting the Palestinian cause, and which Arab states are supporting the Palestinian cause in a positive way and not just for their own benefits, right, whatever they might be? Thank you.
That's a big question. And if you want me to answer it comprehensively, I'd have to go back over many decades. A couple of things. There's a poll that was done about a year ago by the Arab Center in Doha of, I think, 12,000 respondents in 11 Arab countries. And it showed that popular support for the Palestine cause is about as high as it's ever been. It hasn't really waned in most Arab countries, and they went across a range of Arab countries. But what you see is governments who do nothing about this, largely because they're unrepresentative, or because they're afraid of the United States. So one thing that has to happen, and which actually used to happen in the past, is that it has to be made clear to the United States that it cannot trample Palestinian rights and not pay some kind of cost in its relationship with the Arab world. When the United States supported Israel during the 1973 war, there was an oil embargo. When the United States supported Israel in the 1967 war, many Arab countries broke relations with the United States. Now, I'm no great fan of the regimes that did these things. I don't think they were necessarily leading the Arab world or the Palestinians in the right direction. But it was clear to American policymakers that however great their love for Israel, and however great their desire for, whether it's votes or campaign contributions or favorable media coverage, they could only go so far in derogating Palestinian rights and in unlimited support for Israel. Well, that's no longer the case. And that's partly, or largely, I would argue, because of the situation in the Arab world. So I'm arguing that has got to change, and that's not in the hands of the Palestinians. They can do something that they did very well in the 1960s and the 1970s, when you had a lot of unrepresentative Arab governments, but Arab governments that were responsive to their own public opinion and to Palestinian public opinion, which is to talk over the heads of the governments to the Arab public. And that the PLO used to do, this miserable leadership, or these miserable leaderships, have ceased to do. They're terrified of the Arab governments. They won't counter, they won't cross them. And you have to be able to do that. It's not an easy thing to do. The PLO paid dearly for its willingness to cross Arab regimes. Dozens and dozens of Palestinian leaders were assassinated by Israel. Many dozens were also assassinated by Arab regimes, in particular the Syrian regime, the Iraqi regime, the Libyan regime. So there's a cost to doing that. But I think the Palestinians have to be willing to pay a certain cost in their relations with some Arab governments to speak over the heads of these, especially the unrepresentative ones. You don't pay a cost when you talk to the Kuwaiti people. You talk to the Kuwaiti press. They have a free press. They have a parliament. They have political parties. Lebanon is the same. Tunisia is the same. But in the other countries, like Egypt or Saudi Arabia, there is a cost to be paid. And I think you have to be willing to pay that cost. And if you do, that public opinion that the polls tell us is supportive of the Palestinians can be actuated. And that, in turn, will make the United States realize that doing the kinds of things that it's doing is not cost-free.
Annexation, my understanding is under international law, illegal.
Correct.
How does that get implemented?
All it will require is a U.S. administration which is willing to respect international law for every aspect, insofar as annexation and other illegal acts carried out in the past or to be carried out in the future by Israel, to become null and void. I mean, we have an administration which doesn't care about international law. The United States quite frequently flouts international law, it must be said. But in the past, it has at least paid lip service to international law, insofar as annexation and occupation, the law of occupation and other things are concerned. This administration does not. All it will take is the election of an administration which respects international law for the rubber band to snap right back. And everything that Netanyahu is going to do on Saturday or whenever he annexes whatever he annexes will once again be exposed as completely unacceptable to everybody in the international community. So there is not now de facto a state of Palestine. What Israel has been doing since 1967 is to make it impossible for there to be a Palestinian state. And as far as Israel is concerned, there never will be an independent, sovereign, contiguous Palestinian state. Thank you all very much.